Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I take the same subway to work every morning. Same train, same time, same seat if I can get it. It's a routine I don't think much about, just a mindless part of my day. One that I go through without really seeing anyone around me. But yesterday something changed. And now I can't stop thinking about it. The train was crowded but quiet. Rush hour always packed the subway with a mix of office workers, students, and exhausted night shift employees heading home. I had managed to find a seat near the middle of the car, wedged between a woman scrolling through emails and an older man staring blankly at the floor. I had my headphones in, my usual playlist humming low in the background, but I wasn't really listening. I was just staring at my phone, flipping through news headlines, waiting for the ride to be over. That's when I felt it. Not a touch, not a sound. Just a feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it at first. People glance at each other all the time on the subway. It's normal. But the sensation wouldn't go away. It crawled up my spine, an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. Slowly I looked up. There was a man sitting directly across from me, phone in hand. He looked normal enough, mid-30s. Dark jacket, short, unkempt hair. But something about him felt off. It wasn't just that he was looking at me. It was how he was looking. Not casually, not like he had just happened to glance up from his screen. His eyes flicked between me and his phone, almost like he was checking something. I frowned, shifting in my seat, trying to shake the unease curling in my stomach. I was probably imagining things, reading too much into it. Then, in the dull reflection of the subway window behind him, I saw his screen, and my blood ran cold. It was a photo of me, not a live camera feed, not a reflection. A picture, a still image of my face, clear as day, taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I felt my chest tighten. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was a stock photo of someone who looked like me. But then, he swiped left. Another photo. Me again. Swipe. Another. And another. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. The pictures weren't just from today. Some of them were from weeks ago. Months. My heart slammed against my ribs. What the hell was I looking at? I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe through the sudden nausea threatening to rise in my throat. I needed to know for sure. I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust my bag, angling my head just enough to see his screen better. The next photo made my stomach drop. It was of me in my apartment. Not a selfie, not something I had taken. A photo of me sitting on my couch, in my pajamas. I stopped breathing. That picture wasn't on my phone. I knew for a fact I had never posted it, never sent it, never taken it. How did he have it? I sat frozen, my entire body locked in place. The subway rumbled along the tracks, rocking slightly as it carried us forward, but everything around me blurred into nothing. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I needed to move. I needed to say something. But what? My mouth felt dry. My fingers curled into my lap, blood draining from my knuckles. Then, before I could even process what I was doing, I spoke. "Where did you get those?" My own voice startled me. It came out hollow, quieter than I expected. The man's head snapped up. His expression barely changed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of amusement, like he had been waiting for me to say something. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he smirked. a small, almost imperceptible curl of his lips. And then, without a word, he stood up. The train slowed. We were pulling into the next station. I turned in my seat, my pulse racing. He started walking toward the doors, completely unbothered, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. I should have followed him, should have demanded an answer, but my body wouldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in place, watching him leave. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. He stepped off onto the platform and disappeared into the crowd. Gone. I sat there for 3 more stops, my mind spinning, replaying everything. The photos, the way he looked at me, the fact that he didn't even try to hide it. Finally, I forced myself to move. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving before my brain could catch up. I opened my camera roll, scanned through my albums, checked my social media. Nothing. None of those pictures existed anywhere on my accounts. I went through every folder, every archive, even my cloud backups. Nothing. It didn't make sense. The only way he could have gotten that photo of me at home was if someone else had taken it, or if someone had access to my camera without me knowing. A sickening realization settled in my stomach. Had my phone been hacked? I switched off my Wi-Fi, disabled my Bluetooth, deleted every third-party app I didn't recognize. I wasn't even sure if it would help, but I was panicking, grasping at anything that made me feel like I had control. The train screeched to a stop at my station. I stepped off in a daze, checking over my shoulder instinctively. He was gone, but something told me this wasn't over. As I walked toward my apartment, my phone buzzed. A notification. An airdrop request. My breath hitched. The file name was just one word. Smile. I stared at the screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. The preview image was blurred, but I could still make out the shape of a face. My face. And I wasn't smiling. I didn't accept the airdrop. I couldn't. My fingers hovered over the screen, my breath shallow, heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. The file name, Smile. The preview image, my own face, blurred but unmistakable. I didn't know what to do. If I accepted it, I'd be letting this person, whoever they were, send something directly to my phone. But if I declined, then what? Would they just try again? I quickly looked around, scanning the crowd outside the subway station. No one seemed out of place. Dozens of people, all caught up in their own route and checking their phones, rushing to their next destination, oblivious to the fact that I was losing my mind. Was he still here? Watching? I clenched my phone, my stomach twisting. I knew airdrop requests only worked within a certain range. He had to be close. I glanced over my shoulder. A man in a navy hoodie leaned against the wall near the exit, staring at his phone. A woman with a stroller scrolled absent-mindedly while waiting for her ride. A group of teenagers laughed over something on their screens. Any one of them could have sent it. Or none of them. My phone buzzed again. The airdrop request timed out. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry, my skin crawling. Who was doing this? I rushed out of the station, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. My hands were still trembling as I unlocked my apartment door, practically slamming it shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to get my thoughts straight. Then, I opened my phone. I went straight to my airdrop settings. It was set to everyone. I didn't remember changing it to that. With shaking hands, I switched it to contacts only. Then, just to be safe, I turned off Bluetooth entirely. I needed to figure this out. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through every possible explanation. Was my phone hacked? I checked my privacy settings, my camera permissions, my app data. Nothing looked unusual. No unknown devices linked to my account, no strange apps running in the background. But then again, would I even know what to look for? I tried to be rational. Maybe it was a prank. Some random subway creep messing with me, sending airdrops to strangers just to freak them out. But that didn't explain the photos. The ones on his phone. The ones of me. How the hell did he have them? And then, another thought crept in I didn't want to consider. What if my apartment was compromised? That picture of me in my pajamas, someone had to have taken it. From inside my own home, I felt my stomach twist. I stood up, moving room by room, checking every inch of my apartment. I opened every closet, pushed aside the coats, checked under the bed, ran my fingers along the edges of my mirror, looking for anything off. I stared up at the smoke detector. My heart pounded in my chest. It was just a normal detector. No hidden lenses, no strange black dots like the ones I had read about online. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed a chair, stood on it, and pulled the smoke detector from the ceiling. My hands fumbled as I pried it open. Nothing. No wires, no cameras, just a regular battery-powered alarm. I let out a slow, shaky breath. I was losing it, but something in me wouldn't let it go. I checked the air vents, the shower head, the tiny gap between the fridge and the wall. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew what I was afraid of, and I was terrified that I'd find it. That night I was terrified. Every sound made my skin freeze. Every shadow seemed too dark, too deep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. For what, I wasn't sure. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, my phone was vibrating. A text. Unknown number. Check your email. A slow wave of dread rolled through me. I didn't want to check, but I did. My inbox had one new email. No subject line, no sender name. I hesitated before tapping it open. There was just one attachment. A video file. I exhaled sharply, my fingers icy as I tapped the screen. The video was dark at first. Then the image came into focus. My apartment. My bedroom. The angle was slightly tilted like a camera had been placed low to the ground, near the floor. The video was grainy, dimly lit by the glow of my bedside lamp. And then movement. My chest tightened. In the frame, I saw myself. Lying in bed, asleep. My breath hitched. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from last night. A full-body shiver ran through me. Someone had recorded me in my own apartment. While I was sleeping, I felt a wave of nausea. The video kept playing. I wanted to turn it off, but I couldn't look away. Then, near the end, something changed. The camera angle shifted slightly, as if someone had picked it up. For the briefest moment, I saw movement near the bottom of the screen, a shape, a hand. And then, just before the video cut off, a face. Just a flicker of it. Too fast to fully process. But I saw enough. It was him. The man from the subway. He had been inside my apartment, watching me, recording me. My stomach lurched. I dropped my phone onto the table, stumbling backward, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. This was real. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some stupid prank. He had been here. He had been in my home. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I dialed 911. The line rang once, twice. Then, before the dispatcher could even speak, I choked out the words, "There's someone watching me." The 911 dispatcher's voice came through the speaker, calm but firm. "What's your emergency?" I was shaking too hard to answer right away. My breath came out uneven, my mind still reeling from the video I had just watched. I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. "There's someone watching me. He was in my apartment." A pause. Then, is he still inside now? I glanced around, my pulse roaring in my ears. The apartment was silent, no footsteps, no movement, but I didn't trust it. I don't know, I admitted, my voice breaking slightly, but I have proof he sent me a video of me from last night. Another pause. The dispatcher's voice remained steady. I'm sending officers to your location now. Can you safely leave the apartment? I wanted to. I wanted to run, to grab my keys and bolt, to never set foot in this place again. But I had checked everything earlier. The doors, the windows, the vents. There had been nothing. So how had he gotten in? I felt my stomach twist. If he had a way in, what if he was still here? I exhaled shakily, gripping my phone. I'm leaving now. I grabbed my keys with trembling fingers and headed for the front door. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled with the lock. I had just turned the knob when the floor creaked. Right behind me. Every nerve in my body froze. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. The dispatcher was still on the line. I whispered, barely audible. Someone's here. A sharp inhale from the other end. Get out now. My entire body snapped into motion. The cold air hit me as I stumbled into the hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't look back, I just ran. I only stopped once I was outside, standing under the streetlights, gasping for air. Then I heard the sirens. The cops didn't waste time. They swept the apartment, guns drawn. I stood outside, arms wrapped tightly around myself, my entire body still trembling. Minutes passed. Then one of the officers reappeared, shaking his head. Nobody's inside. I swallowed hard. There has to be. I heard him. The officer frowned but didn't dismiss me. They kept searching. Then something changed. One of them called from the bedroom. Found something. A surge of dread hit me as I followed them inside. My apartment looked the same, normal, like nothing had happened. But as I stepped into my bedroom, I saw where the officer was standing by my closet. The door was wide open. Inside, my clothes hung undisturbed. My shoes were neatly lined up against the wall. But the officer wasn't looking at my clothes. He was looking above them. At the ceiling panel, a small square attic access panel, one that had been shifted slightly out of place. I yanked the door open and sprinted. I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. I had never noticed it before. One of the officers grabbed a chair, standing on it, to push the panel open. The moment he did, a wave of cold, stale air drifted down. Then a rope ladder, rolled up, hidden against the beams. Someone had been climbing up there. My entire body went numb. He had been in the ceiling, watching me, listening. One of the officers climbed up, flashlight in hand. I held my breath, barely aware that I was gripping my own arms so tightly my fingers were digging into my skin. Then his voice. Jesus, you're gonna want to see this. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. They helped me up the ladder, and as my head poked through the opening, my stomach lurched. It was a small crawl space. Not an actual attic, just a narrow stretch of beams and insulation. But there was enough room to lie down. And someone had. A thin mattress, a pile of food wrappers, empty water bottles. And the worst part? A notebook. I felt sick as one of the officers flipped it open. The pages were filled with dates, notes, times. My name. The officer turned a page, his jaw tightening. Then he showed it to me. My stomach dropped. It was a sketch of my bedroom. The bed, the closet, the exact position of my desk, my mirror, everything. And in the corner, drawn with painful detail, a tiny camera, tucked behind my bookshelf. My breath hitched. I spun around, staring at my bookshelf like it had just come alive. The officers moved fast. They pulled the bookshelf away from the wall. And there it was, a small black camera, perfectly hidden, perfectly placed, watching me every night. I thought I was going to be sick. One of the officers exhaled sharply. He's been here a while. I stared at the mattress in the attic, the wrappers, the notes. How long had he been living above me? 1 month? 2? Long enough to memorize my routines. Long enough to know exactly when I was asleep. I didn't go back to the apartment, not even to grab my things. The police took everything as evidence. The camera, the notebook, the rope ladder, but they never found him. Whoever he was gone. Vanished, like he had never existed at all. They checked the security footage from my building, looking for someone entering or leaving. But there was nothing. No signs of forced entry. No records of anyone coming in that shouldn't have been there. It was like he had been inside the whole time. And then, a few days later, I got another email. No subject, no message. Just one attachment. A photo of me, sleeping. Timestamp 2 nights ago. After I had already left, I changed everything. New number, new email. I moved across the city, got a new job, found an apartment with no attic, no crawl spaces, no vents big enough for anyone to hide in. And still, sometimes late at night I wake up feeling watched. I tell myself it's paranoia, that I'm safe, that he's gone. But deep down, I know the truth. He was never trying to hurt me. He was just watching. And maybe he still is. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding. I felt like I was being watched. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent my heart racing. I stayed in my tent, clutching a knife, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward my truck. As I passed the spot where I'd seen the man the day before, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were barefoot, long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They led off the trail and disappeared into the dense woods. I didn't stick around to investigate. I made it back to my truck, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away from that forest. To this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered out there. Was it just a drunken man lost in the woods, or something far darker? A skinwalker, perhaps, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I'll never be sure. I'm not easily frightened. In fact, if you were to ask anyone who knows me, they'd tell you I'm the last person to flinch at strange noises in the night. I've spent years camping alone in remote areas across the country. No one who's ever traveled as much as I have would bat an eye at a few rustling leaves or the distant call of an animal. But the night I spent in Rabbit Valley changed everything. It was a quiet evening. Too quiet, maybe. I'd been driving for hours, crossing the border between Colorado and Utah, and I needed to rest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place far enough from the highway to sleep without the hum of cars or the glare of streetlights. Rabbit Valley seemed like the perfect spot. It was desolate, surrounded by nothing but wide open space and rugged terrain. I'd heard about it from other campers as a peaceful, remote site, ideal for solitude. So, I parked my truck at one of the isolated campsites, which were at least 15 to 20 miles from the nearest road. There was only one other rig in the area, and they were far off in the distance. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. It was quiet. I set up my teepee-style tent, a new purchase off of Amazon. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me sheltered from the elements. The air was cold, crisp, and still, just the way I liked it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got settled in, ready to drift off. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the serene quiet, but it didn't last long. I woke to an odd sound, something faint but persistent. It started out as a scraping noise, almost like someone dragging their fingers across the nylon of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a light, deliberate sound, like someone was walking around my tent, running their fingers along the edges of the fabric. Slowly, methodically, back and forth, I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything outside my tent. There were no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart began to race. It was as if someone was walking in a slow circle around my tent, deliberately making sure I could hear every scrape of their fingers. The sound was eerily rhythmic, like they had all the time in the world. Minutes dragged on. Maybe it was only 5 minutes. Maybe it was 15. It felt like an eternity. I tried to steady my breath to remain calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scraping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, my mind racing. Every inch of me screamed to act, to do something, but I didn't. I stayed there silent, listening. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, some animal brushing up against the tent. But something inside me knew better. Another 15 minutes passed. The silence now felt suffocating. Then, without warning, it happened. My tent, the one I'd just pitched with such care, suddenly caved in. The center pole collapsed, and the entire structure folded inward, trapping me inside. I had a brief moment of disorientation, and I realized the only thing holding the tent at an angle was a small support beam that had somehow managed to stay intact. My heart was hammering in my chest as I ripped open the zipper of my tent. I didn't think, I just acted. I bolted out of the tent and ran for my truck. I crawled into the bed, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the grip, but I didn't feel safe enough to sleep. I stayed wide awake the entire night, waiting for daylight. The darkness outside seemed to close in on me, as if something were waiting for me to fall asleep. When the sun finally rose, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and went straight back to the campsite. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just my nerves? Was I imagining it? But deep down I knew I wasn't. Something was off, very off. I went to inspect the area, hoping to find some sign that would explain it away. Maybe it was a bear or a large animal that brushed up against the tent. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on, and that's when I saw them. Around my tent, in the cold desert dirt and snow, there were shoe prints. They weren't mine. I recognized my own tracks, leading to and from the campsite, but these were different. They were made by boots with pointed toes, deep imprints in the ground. The pattern they made was unmistakable. It was clear that someone had walked around my tent. Not just once, but multiple times. The prints were in a circle, as though someone had been pacing around me while I was inside. There were no other tracks, just these circular prints, making a steady loop around my tent, as if whoever it was had been studying me, waiting, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when it hit me. They had known I was inside. They knew I was alone. Hi, my name is Jake, and I love to camp. I always have ever since I was a kid. There's something about being out in the wilderness. No traffic, no buzzing lights, no constant flood of information demanding my attention. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the distant call of an owl, and the steady crackle of a fire keeping the dark at bay. I do most of my camping alone. Not because I don't have friends, I do. But there's something different about being out there by yourself. You become more aware of your surroundings. Every rustling branch, every snap of a twig, it all means something. In the city, you can ignore background noise. Out there, you listen. I've done solo hikes all over the country, from national parks to deep remote forests where I wouldn't see another human for miles. I know how to handle myself. I follow all the rules. Let someone know where I'm going. Bring extra supplies. Stay on mapped trails. I've never been the type to get scared easily. Until now, I don't know how to explain what happened, but I need to get it out. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Or maybe someone out there has experienced the same thing, because I can't be the only one. I went out on this trip about a month ago. It was supposed to be a quick 3-day solo camp in an area I'd been to before, a dense stretch of forest about 4 hours from the nearest town. The place was quiet, isolated, and peaceful, perfect. I parked my car at the trailhead around noon, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started the 5-mile hike to the spot I'd picked. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I'd found on a previous trip, tucked away by a small, slow-moving creek. The hike in was uneventful. I passed maybe one other person, a guy heading back toward the trailhead. He gave me a polite nod, but didn't stop to talk. That was the last person I saw. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping lower, the sky turning that soft, dusky blue that signals the start of the night. I made quick work of setting up my tent, gathering some firewood, and heating up a quick meal. As the fire crackled in front of me, I felt that familiar sense of peace settle in. Nothing but the trees, the stars, and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the canopy. That first night I slept like a rock. It was the next morning that I knew something was wrong. I woke up early, the cold biting at my skin. The first thing I noticed was how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then I saw my backpack. It was open, not just unzipped, completely pulled apart. At first I panicked, thinking an animal had gotten into my things, but nothing was missing. Not my food, not my water, not even the jerky I had left out by mistake. The only things that had been touched were my map, my knife, and my notebook. They had been pulled out and left sitting on top of my sleeping bag. I felt my stomach tighten. Had I done that? Maybe I'd rummaged through my pack during the night, half asleep? That's what I told myself. Then I stepped outside my tent and saw the footprints. Not mine. Another set. Larger. Heavier. Circling my tent. Not approaching, not leaving, just circling. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I crouched down to examine them, my fingers hovering just above the indentations in the dirt. Fresh. They hadn't been there the night before. A sudden wave of unease rolled through me. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my tent while I was sleeping. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe the guy I passed on the way in had changed his mind and come back. Maybe a park ranger had been checking the area. But no. No one hikes this deep into the woods just to walk in circles around a stranger's tent and leave without a word. I scanned the trees, suddenly feeling exposed. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off. It was early morning. The logical thing to do was pack up and leave. I could cut my trip short, call it bad luck, and get back to my car before noon. But something inside me rebelled against that idea. I had been camping alone for years. I wasn't about to let some unexplained footprints send me packing. So I forced myself to go about my day as planned. But I kept my knife within reach just in case. The second night was worse. I had spent the whole day trying to convince myself it was nothing, that the footprints could have been there before I arrived, that maybe I had been too groggy to remember if I had unzipped my pack. But as soon as the sun started to set, that feeling crept back in, that nagging, suffocating sense of being watched. I kept my fire going longer than usual. Normally I let it die down before I turn in, but that night I kept feeding it, listening to the way the flames crackled in the dark, listening for anything else. By the time I forced myself to crawl into my tent, my body was tense with exhaustion. I closed my eyes, gripping my knife beneath my sleeping bag, my ears straining for any sound beyond the wind in the trees. At some point I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but I remember exactly what I saw. The walls of my tent were illuminated from the fire's dying embers, casting a faint glow against the fabric. And there just outside was a shadow, tall, motionless, standing right beside my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed, feeling my pulse hammering in my skull. The shadow didn't shift, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. My fingers clenched tighter around my knife, my entire body locked in fear. Then, a slow, deliberate scraping sound against the fabric of my tent, and a voice, low, whispering, "Why are you still here?" I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The voice had been so close, like someone had been standing just inches from my tent, whispering directly to me through the fabric. I felt my entire body coil like a spring, every muscle locked in place. The scraping sound came again slow, deliberate, like something dragging a fingertip across the thin nylon of my tent. I wanted to move. I wanted to burst out, knife in hand, ready to fight if I had to. But I couldn't, because I knew that if I unzipped that tent, if I looked outside, I would see something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that shouldn't be there. My grip tightened around the handle of my knife, my knuckles aching. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the only thing separating me from whoever or whatever was out there was a thin layer of fabric. Then silence. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just nothing. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Still nothing. Was it gone? I listened harder, trying to hear over the frantic beating of my heart. And then, just when I thought the nightmare was over, a deep, guttural exhale, right next to my ear. A low, rasping breath, like someone was leaning down, pressing their mouth against the side of my tent, inches from my head. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved. Fast. I lunged for the zipper, yanking it open in one sharp motion. My knife was already raised as I burst out of the tent, ready to fight. But there was no one there. The clearing was empty. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the moon casting pale silver light across the ground. My fire had burned down to glowing embers, sending soft flickering shadows dancing across the surrounding trunks. I turned in a full circle, my breath coming in short gasps. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling in the bushes, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I had heard. I knew. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, feeding it small branches, staring into the trees, waiting. Nothing happened. No more whispers, no more shadows moving between the trees. But I felt it. That pressure in the air, that undeniable weight of being watched. And that was worse than anything else. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the canopy, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it. My hands were still shaking as I collapsed my tent, rolling it up in a messy bundle and shoving it into its sack. I wasn't taking my time. I wasn't staying a second longer than I had to. By the time I started down the trail, the sun was fully up, but it didn't make me feel any better. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't just that I was shaken. It wasn't just fear. Something about the air itself felt different, like I had stepped into a place I was never meant to be. I kept moving. I was 3 miles into the hike back when I saw the first tree. I almost missed it. I had been walking fast, head down, focused on just getting out. But something made me stop. A tree just off the path. Carved into the bark was a word. Leaving? My stomach dropped. I took a step back, staring at it, my breath caught in my throat. The cuts in the bark looked fresh, like they hadn't even begun to heal over yet. I spun in a full circle, scanning the forest around me. Nothing. No movement, no sounds. Just that same crushing silence. I wanted to believe the carving had been there before, that I had just missed it on the way in. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone or something had carved it during the night, while I was still at camp, and they had known I would find it. I started walking again, faster this time. I wasn't running, not yet, but I wasn't stopping either. I told myself that if I could just get to the car, everything would be fine. I was 2 miles out when I saw the second tree. I almost didn't look. I didn't want to look. But my eyes flicked to it anyway, and I felt my chest tighten. Another carving. Come back. My hands felt clammy, my pulse a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I forced my legs to keep moving. 1 mile. Just 1 more mile. I kept my eyes forward, pushing my body into a near jog. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. And then I saw the third tree, and this time I couldn't stop myself from stumbling to a halt. The carving was lower on the trunk, slashed deep into the bark. Why did you look? I felt like I was going to be sick, because that meant whoever had done this knew. They knew I had woken up that night. They knew I had seen the shadow, had heard the whisper, and they were taunting me. I turned, finally giving in to the urge to run. I sprinted down the trail, my pack bouncing against my back, my breath burning in my chest. I could see the clearing up ahead, the break in the trees where my car was parked. I forced myself to go faster, and then just before I broke through the trees, I heard it. A voice, clear, loud, from somewhere too close. Come back. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just ran. I didn't slow down until I was in my car, the doors locked, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, listening, waiting. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the engine, the rustling of leaves in the wind. I started the car and drove. Didn't look back. Didn't stop. And I told myself I would never go back to that place. It's been weeks since that trip. I haven't been able to sleep right since. Every night I wake up at random hours, heart racing, that whisper still lingering in my ears. Come back. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who or what was in those woods with me. But I know one thing. They weren't human, and they never wanted me to leave. I didn't go back to the woods. Not for weeks. I told myself I wouldn't, that I had learned my lesson, that whatever had been out there, whoever had carved those messages, wasn't something I wanted to understand. But no matter how much I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The whispers followed me home. Not literally, never heard them in my apartment, never found carvings in my door, never saw shadows standing outside my window, but in my head, they never stopped. I kept waking up at random hours of the night, heart pounding, expecting to see something standing in the corner of my bedroom. I checked my closet more times than I'd like to admit. Every noise outside made my stomach tighten. The worst part? I wasn't scared of the woods. I was scared that whatever it was, had followed me. But it hadn't. Not yet. And that's what made it worse. A month after the trip, I started dreaming about it. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the memory of those trees etched into my vision, like I had been there again, standing among them, feeling that same unnatural silence pressing in. In the dream, I was always back at my campsite. The fire had burned out. The woods were too dark, and I wasn't alone. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, the same way you feel someone staring at you from across a room. A presence, standing just behind me, watching, waiting, and then, always the whisper. Why did you look? I'd wake up gasping, gripping my sheets, my heart hammering like I had just sprinted a mile. No matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to shake it, I couldn't get the woods out of my head. It wasn't over, and I knew what I had to do. I went back, not to stay, not to camp, just to prove to myself that nothing was there, that it had all been in my head. That's what I told myself anyway. The drive to the trailhead felt different this time. The first time I had come, I had been excited, at peace, ready to be alone in nature. This time, I felt like I was walking into a crime scene, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. I parked my car and hesitated for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I got out. The trail was the same as before, but it wasn't. The trees felt closer together. The sky looked duller, the air somehow thicker. I moved quickly, my pulse in my ears. I wasn't going to hike all the way back to the campsite, I just needed to check something. The carvings. If they were still there, then I hadn't imagined it. If they were gone, then maybe, just maybe, I could convince myself it had all been in my head. I made it to the first tree. My stomach twisted into knots. The carving was still there. Leaving? The letters were deeper now. The bark around them was blackened, like they had been burned into the tree instead of carved. I swallowed hard, my fingers clenching at my sides. I moved faster. I found the second tree. Come back. The lettering looked new, like it had been carved again recently. My skin prickled. I almost turned back, almost ran for the car, but I had to see the last tree. I had to know. I followed the path until I saw it the final message, the one that had sent me running for my life. And when I saw what was carved into the bark, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the same message. It wasn't "Why did you look?" It was my name, Jake. I felt like my entire body had turned to ice. This wasn't a trick of my mind. This wasn't some prank or illusion. Something out here knew who I was, and I had just walked straight back into its territory. I spun around, my breath ragged, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I felt it. That same unnatural stillness, that same heavy, watching presence. I wasn't alone. I took a step back, then another. I turned and walked as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. I didn't look back. The entire way back to the car, I could feel it, something just beyond my vision, lurking in the trees. Waiting. I reached my car and yanked the door open, slamming it shut behind me, locking it in one frantic motion. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, my chest heaving. I had my proof. And I knew, without a doubt, I was never coming back. I started the engine and pulled out, my tires kicking up dust as I sped down the road. Only when I was miles away, with the forest nothing but a shadow in my rearview mirror, did I finally let myself breathe. It was over. Whatever was out there, whatever had whispered to me in the dark, it had let me go. I wasn't going to push my luck. I wasn't going to chase answers. I was done. It's been 6 months since that trip. I haven't gone camping since, haven't even set foot in a forest. I don't talk about it much, not to friends, not to family, because what would I say? That something out there knew my name? That it carved messages into trees and stood outside my tent at night? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But I don't need anyone to, because I know what I saw. And I know one thing for certain. The woods aren't empty. They never were. And if you hear a whisper in the night, if you wake up to footprints that aren't yours, if you see something standing just beyond the firelight, don't look. And whatever you do, don't go back. I never went back to that apartment, not even once. I didn't care about my furniture, my security deposit, or the things I left behind. Nothing was worth stepping foot in that place again, knowing what had been inside with me. At first, I tried to convince myself that moving away would fix things, that once I was in a new apartment, a new city, a new life, I'd feel safe again. But I didn't. I moved in with Megan for a while, trying to get my footing. She did her best to make me feel comfortable, but I could tell she was worried about me. I wasn't sleeping. I barely ate. Every night, I lay awake in the darkness, my ears tuned to the silence, my eyes locked on the air vent across the room. I knew it was empty. I had checked it 100 times. But that didn't stop me from imagining him in there, waiting, watching, breathing. I couldn't take it anymore. A week after I left the apartment for good, I went to the police station. I didn't know what I expected, I just wanted answers. I wanted to know if they had found him. The officer at the front desk recognized me immediately. I could tell by the way his face shifted, his polite expression faltering for just a second before he forced it back into place. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, "you're the one, wow, from the apartment?" "Yes." My voice came out hoarse. I hadn't spoken much in days. He nodded and glanced at his computer, typing something in. I watched his eyes scan the screen. Then, slowly, he looked back up at me. "There was an investigation," he said carefully. "But the suspect hasn't been identified." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled through his nose, clearly choosing his words. "We found evidence that someone had been living in the vents, but we have no leads on who they were." I felt a sickening wave of nausea. "So, he's still out there?" The officer hesitated. We don't have any reason to believe he's still in the building. He could have been a transient someone, using the ventilation system to move between units. He may have left once he realized the police were involved. I wanted to believe that, but something inside me knew it wasn't that simple. Still, the conversation ended there. No suspect, no arrest, no closure. I went back to Megan's that night and sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. My body wouldn't stop shaking. If they hadn't found him, if they hadn't identified him, that meant he was still out there. I tried to move on. I finally found a new place, a small studio in a newer building, with sealed air vents and no crawl spaces. The very first thing I did before signing the lease was inspect every wall, every corner, every possible hiding space. Still, the paranoia followed me. For months, I checked my closets every single night before bed. I lined the vents with furniture, even though I knew there was no space behind them for anyone to hide. I didn't sleep well, ever. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my fear control me. But some fears aren't irrational. Some fears are born from reality. 6 months later, I got a call from a different police department. It was early, too early, the kind of call that immediately makes your stomach drop before you even answer. The voice on the other end was serious. "Is this my name?" I sat up in bed, gripping my phone. "Yes?" The next sentence made my blood run cold. "We have a man in custody. We believe he may be connected to your case." I sat there silent. My brain couldn't process what I had just heard. The officer continued, "Do you have time to come in for a statement?" I don't remember responding. I don't remember getting dressed. I just remember sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room, shaking so badly that I could barely hold the cup of coffee they handed me. "We arrested him last night," the detective told me. "Caught him trying to break into an apartment across town." I swallowed hard. "He's been doing this for a while," the detective continued. "Moving from place to place, living inside buildings without being noticed." My voice came out in a whisper. "Who is he?" The detective slid a mugshot across the table. I forced myself to look. The man in the photo was young, mid-30s maybe, thin, almost sickly looking, with sunken eyes and messy, unkempt hair. Not a monster, not a deformed, shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Just a man. Oh, that made it worse. "He's been doing this for years," the detective said grimly. "We found evidence that he had been living in multiple apartments across the city, sometimes for months at a time." I felt my stomach lurch. "How did he get inside?" The detective's expression darkened. "Through the vents, just like in your case." I wanted to throw up. He admitted to watching people, the detective continued. He never interacted, never made contact, but he listened. I couldn't breathe. He said he liked the feeling of being there, without them knowing. I shot up from my seat, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need to leave." The detective didn't stop me. He just nodded. "I understand. That was a year ago. He's in prison now. That should make me feel safe. It should make me feel like I can finally breathe again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I still hear it. The soft scratching sound, the faint shuffling. Sometimes I wake up and feel like I'm being watched. Like there's something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I check the vents every night, even though I know I don't have to. Even though I know he's locked away. Because the truth is, I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. Not completely. Because for a long time, I had never been alone. I had just thought I was. And that's what haunts me the most. The highway stretched endlessly before him, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt disappearing into the mist that clung to the Pennsylvania hills. Ethan Graves tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes darting to the GPS mounted on his dash. Blackwood 4 miles ahead. He exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat, trying to shake the creeping unease that had been gnawing at him since he'd taken this assignment. For most of his career, he had been the guy who pulled back the curtain on superstition. He'd exposed fraudulent mediums, busted ghost hunting scams, and dismantled conspiracy theories with hard facts. The supernatural wasn't real, he'd spent years proving that. But something about Blackwood unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. The disappearances weren't just another unsolved case, they were uncanny. Pulling into town, Ethan felt as though he had driven into a place frozen in time. The main street was lined with brick buildings, their paint peeling, windows caked with dust. A rusted neon sign flickered dimly above what had once been a diner. A gas station on the corner displayed prices that suggested it hadn't been operational in years. There were no pedestrians, no movement. It felt abandoned, yet somehow occupied. Ethan parked outside the Blackwood Gazette, the last operating newspaper in town. According to his research, the editor Joseph Wren had been covering the disappearances for years, though no one outside of Blackwood had taken him seriously. He stepped out of his car and was immediately hit with the stillness. No wind, no distant hum of life, just silence. His boots scuffed against the cracked pavement as he walked to the newspaper's entrance. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and a bell above it jingled. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and ink. A single desk lamp illuminated the office, casting long shadows over stacks of yellowed newspapers. Behind the desk, Joseph Wren, a thin man with graying hair and hollow cheeks, looked up. His eyes were sunken, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from a lack of sleep, but from years of carrying something heavy. "You the reporter?" Wren's voice was rough, as if he hadn't spoken in a while. "Ethan Graves," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Wren didn't take it. Instead, he gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "You're here about the missing people," Wren said, rubbing his jaw. "Yeah. Your articles were the only ones that took this seriously," Ethan replied, pulling out his notebook. "I've gone through them, but what I don't understand is how no one outside this town has noticed that people are just disappearing." "Because no one remembers them," Wren said quietly. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Wren exhaled sharply, leaning forward. "People disappear all the time, right? Big cities, small towns. But when someone goes missing here, it's different. Families report them missing. Then a few days later, it's like they never existed. No records, no photos, no memories." Ethan's skepticism kicked in. "That's impossible. Someone has to remember them." Wren shook his head. "I've lived here my whole life. I remember people that don't exist anymore. I have newspaper clippings of missing persons reports that no one else acknowledges. It's like Blackwood erases them." A chill crawled up Ethan's spine, but he forced himself to stay logical. "And you think this is connected to Ravenwood Psychiatric?" Wren hesitated, his fingers tapping the desk. "I don't think it is. I know it is." Ethan glanced around the office. Tacked to the walls were photographs sold, grainy black and white shots of buildings, streets, people. In several of them, he saw the same tall, faceless figure standing in the background, slightly blurred, like a smudge on the film. "Who is that?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Wren swallowed hard. "The Hollow Man." Ethan turned to him. "You really believe in that?" Wren's jaw tightened. "I don't care what you believe, Graves. What I know is that every person who went missing, that thing was there somewhere in the last photo taken of them." Ethan stared at the figure in the photographs. The shape was unmistakable, a tall, thin silhouette in dark clothes, its head featureless. It could have been a photographic error, a trick of the light. But it was in multiple photos, spanning decades. Ethan shook off the discomfort. "Where's Lena Holloway? I was told she used to be a cop here." Wren hesitated. "She doesn't talk to reporters." "She'll talk to me," Ethan said. Wren sighed, scribbling an address on a notepad before sliding it over. "She's out past the old railway yard. If she slams the door in your face, don't take it personally." Ethan pocketed the note and stood. "One last thing. Ravenwood Psychiatric, how do I get inside?" Wren's expression darkened. "You don't. That's not going to work for me." "You don't get it," Wren snapped. "The hospital isn't just abandoned. It's wrong. You walk in and the layout changes. Hallways that go in circles. Doors that lead to places they shouldn't. People who go in alone never come back." Ethan held his gaze. I don't believe in ghost stories. Wren leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Then you're already in trouble. Ethan left the newspaper office, stepping back into the oppressive quiet of the town. The sky had darkened with thick clouds, and the streetlights cast weak, flickering pools of light on the pavement. He climbed into his car, pulling out his phone to check the address Wren had given him. A sudden chill made the hairs on his arms stand up. He glanced at his side mirror. Down the street, standing just beyond the reach of the dim streetlight, was a figure. Tall, still, faceless. Ethan whipped his head around, looking directly down the street. Nothing was there. His breath caught in his throat. He rubbed his eyes, exhaling sharply. This town was already getting to him. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, heading toward Lena Holloway's house. He didn't notice the static flickering across his dashboard screen. He didn't hear the whisper that crackled softly over his car radio. Come home. Ethan drove through the outskirts of Blackwood, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The figure in the side mirror had been a trick of the light. It had to be. His brain was playing games with him, primed by the eerie silence of the town and the paranoia Wren had planted in his mind. Still, he kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Hollow Man standing on the side of the road. The drive to Lena Holloway's house took him past rows of abandoned skeletal homes, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The railway yard, once a hub for the mining industry, was nothing more than rusted train cars and collapsed buildings. Time had eaten away at Blackwood, leaving behind something hollow and crumbling. Lena's house was at the edge of the yard, a small, weathered one-story home with a chain-link fence that sagged in places. A single light flickered from the front porch, casting a dull glow over the gravel driveway. Ethan pulled in and stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth and rusting metal. As he approached the house, the front door creaked open before he even had the chance to knock. Lena Holloway stood in the doorway, her posture stiff, a Glock 19 resting against her thigh. "You're the reporter," she said, her voice low and even. Ethan lifted his hands slightly. "Ethan Graves. Wren sent me." Lena studied him for a long moment before stepping back. "Come in. Keep your hands where I can see them." Ethan entered. The house was surprisingly neat, filled with bookshelves stacked with case files, newspaper clippings, and photographs pinned to corkboards. The air smelled of old paper and faint traces of gun oil. Lena locked the door behind him. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features and the weary look of someone who had seen too much. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. "Let's get this straight," she said, crossing her arms. "I don't do interviews." "Good," Ethan replied, "because I don't care about a story. I care about the truth." She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "That's what I used to think too." Ethan gestured to the wall of photographs. "You were investigating a missing persons case in Blackwood, right? What happened?" Lena exhaled slowly and walked over to one of the corkboards, tapping a photo of a young woman. Amanda Hayes, 24 years old. "She disappeared in 2017, Lena said. Came to Blackwood to visit family. One night, she walked home alone after dinner with friends. Never made it back. No witnesses. No leads. It was like she just stopped existing." Ethan took a step closer. "But you didn't let it go." Lena shook her head. Something was wrong. People weren't just missing, they were erased. When I started investigating, I found out the Hollow Man wasn't just an urban legend. There was evidence. She pulled out a folder and slapped it onto the table. Ethan opened it, flipping through grainy security footage stills. In every single one, Amanda Hayes was there. And in the background, the same tall, faceless figure. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was a reflection in a window. Other times, just a distorted silhouette in a shadow. But it was always there. Ethan swallowed. "You think she saw it before she vanished?" Lena nodded. She told her friends she had been having nightmares, that she heard whispers at night, then a few days later gone. Ethan flipped to another page in the folder. "What did the police say?" Lena's jaw clenched. "They stopped talking to me, started acting like Amanda never existed. Her parents? A week after she went missing, they claimed they never had a daughter." Ethan froze. "What?" "They had no memory of her. I went to their house, showed them pictures, recorded her birth certificate, for Christ's sake. and they looked at me like I was insane. They thought she was a stranger. Blackwood made them forget. Ethan felt his throat go dry. He wanted to argue, but Wren had said the same thing. What happened after that? Lena hesitated. I kept pushing. Then, I saw him. Ethan felt a cold sensation crawl up his spine. The Hollow Man. Lena met his gaze. Yeah, first, I started seeing things in my peripheral vision. Shadows where they shouldn't be. Then my car radio started picking up whispers. One night I woke up and saw him standing at the foot of my bed. Ethan's stomach turned. What did he do? Lena's voice was barely a whisper. Nothing, he just watched. Then he was gone. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I need to get into Ravenwood Psychiatric, he said. Lena stared at him. That's a mistake. I don't have a choice, Ethan said. That place is the center of everything. I need to see it myself. Lena's expression hardened. You're not going in alone. Before Ethan could respond, the lights flickered. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his chest. The old television in the corner crackled to life, static hissing from the speakers. Then, a voice, distorted, hollow. Come home. Ethan and Lena both turned toward the screen. The static twisted, forming a dark silhouette. Tall, faceless, watching. Then, the screen went black. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena grabbed her gun. We need to go, she said. Now. Ethan felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted the truth anymore. But it was too late to turn back now. Ethan and Lena stood frozen, staring at the darkened television screen. The air inside the small house felt thick, heavy with something unseen. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It's just interference, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Old CRT TVs pick up random signals sometimes. Shut up. Lena's voice was sharp, edged with something close to panic. Her grip tightened on the gun in her hand, her knuckles white. She moved quickly, stepping toward the windows and checking the locks. Ethan realized that despite her hardened exterior, she was genuinely afraid. She had seen this before. You heard that, right? Ethan asked. Lena nodded once. Yeah, and we need to go. Now. Ethan hesitated. Where? Lena grabbed a duffel bag from under the couch and slung it over her shoulder. Somewhere public, somewhere with people. Ethan frowned. The town is basically a ghost town. Exactly. She moved toward the door, but something stopped her. A sound. A faint scraping outside, like footsteps on gravel. Lena raised her gun. Her eyes darted to Ethan, silently signaling him to stay quiet. He nodded, his pulse hammering in his throat. The porch light flickered. Then a shadow passed across the window. Ethan's breath caught. Someone was out there. Or something. Lena took slow, measured steps toward the front door, gesturing for Ethan to follow her lead. He did, swallowing hard, trying to control the tremor in his hands. Another scrape. Closer this time. Lena swung the door open. Nothing. The front yard was empty, the gravel driveway untouched. The only movement came from the wind stirring the trees beyond the fence line. But Ethan knew what he'd seen. There had been something outside. Lena scanned the area with sharp, practiced eyes, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. Get in the car, she muttered. Ethan didn't argue. They hurried to his car. As Ethan slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembled against the steering wheel. Lena threw her duffel into the back and slammed the passenger door shut. Drive, she ordered. Ethan turned the key. The engine sputtered. Wouldn't start. He turned it again. Click, click, click. Nothing. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Lena's breathing hitched. She looked toward the house. The light. Ethan followed her gaze. The porch light that had been flickering before was now steady, bright, too bright. And something stood in its glow. A tall, faceless figure. Still, motionless, watching them. Lena grabbed Ethan's arm. Don't look at it. Ethan couldn't move. His brain screamed at him to turn away, but his body refused to obey. The figure was wrong in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. His mind struggled to process its existence, as if it were something that shouldn't be there at all. The porch light flickered. The figure vanished. Ethan gasped, twisting to look at Lena. What the hell was that? Lena was already reaching for his keys. She yanked them from the ignition and shoved them into his hands. Try again. Ethan's fingers fumbled as he turned the key. The engine roared to life. Go, now. Ethan slammed the car into reverse, gravel spitting under the tires. He whipped the wheel, throwing the car around before gunning it down the empty road. Neither of them spoke for several miles. The silence in the car was suffocating. Finally, Ethan dared to glance at Lena. Her jaw was clenched tight, her fingers tapping restlessly against her thigh. She was still gripping the gun. You've seen it before, Ethan said quietly. Lena exhaled sharply. I told you. The night Amanda Hayes disappeared, I saw it. And then it was everywhere, watching me. Ethan shook his head. This doesn't make sense. How does a persona, whole person, just stop existing? Lena didn't answer immediately. She stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. I don't think it just takes people, she finally said. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Lena hesitated. Then, in a voice so low he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, I think it takes who they are. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. The Hollow Man didn't just erase people. It erased their existence, their identity, their memories, their place in the world. His throat felt dry. So what happens if we keep digging? Lena turned to him, her expression hard. We find out what happened at Ravenwood. Ethan nodded, staring ahead at the dark road. They had to go there. The psychiatric hospital was the key, and something inside it was still waiting. They arrived at Ravenwood just after midnight. The abandoned asylum loomed at the edge of town, its skeletal remains swallowed by overgrown weeds and twisted vines. The iron gates stood open, rusted hinges broken long ago. Ethan parked a short distance away, cutting the engine. The silence out here felt different. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something unseen. Lena checked her gun and flashlight. You sure about this? Ethan asked. Lena didn't answer. She just started walking. Ethan followed, the ground crunching beneath his boots as they stepped through the gates. The front entrance was boarded up, but the side doors had been pried open long ago. A faint smell of mildew and something rotting clung to the air as they stepped inside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing crumbling walls, peeling paint, and scattered debris. A faint hiss of static crackled through the air. Ethan turned to Lena. Did you hear? The door slammed shut behind them. Lena spun, gun raised. The hallway ahead of them stretched longer than it should have. Doors lined both sides, each one slightly ajar. The light above flickered. Then, somewhere deep inside the asylum, a voice echoed. Come home. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Lena grabbed his arm. Run. The moment the voice echoed through the abandoned asylum, Ethan's body tensed. The two simple words "come home" crawled under his skin, wrapping around his bones like ice-cold tendrils. He didn't want to believe it was real. But the way Lena's grip tightened on his arm, the sharp edge of fear in her eye as she had heard it too. Then the lights flickered again, and the hallway shifted. Ethan's breath caught. The walls seemed to stretch, the shadows deepening, swallowing parts of the corridor in unnatural darkness. The doors, all slightly ajar before, were now wide open. And something moved inside the rooms. Lena jerked him backward. We need to go. Now. Ethan nodded, his pulse hammering. They ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Dust kicked up around them as they sprinted, Lena's flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. They turned a corner, only to find themselves facing a dead end. Ethan skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. This wasn't here before. Lena turned, scanning the area. It's the hospital, she muttered. It doesn't stay the same. Ethan wiped a hand over his face, trying to steady his breathing. That's not possible. Lena gave him a hard look. You still think this is a ghost story? Ethan didn't answer. A soft creak echoed behind them. They turned slowly. At the end of the hall where they had just come from, a shadow stretched across the floor. Long, unmoving, watching. Ethan's fingers went numb. It was there. A tall, faceless figure, standing at the entrance of the corridor. The Hollow Man. Lena raised her gun. Don't look at it. Ethan's breathing turned shallow. Lena grabbed his arm and yanked him into a nearby room. She slammed the door shut, bolting it as fast as she could. The room was small, an old patient's cell. A rusted bed frame sat in the corner, the mattress long rotted away. Scratches covered the walls, hundreds of them, deep gouges in the paint. Ethan pressed his ear to the door, listening. Silence. Then, soft footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming closer. Lena's hands were trembling. It's hunting us. Ethan swallowed hard. His heart slammed against his ribs. The air in the room had changed. Thicker, suffocating. The walls felt closer than before. Then he noticed something on the floor. A crumpled piece of paper. He bent down and picked it up. The edges were brittle, yellowed with age. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "I see him everywhere. He whispers when the lights go out. He won't let me leave." A sharp bang sounded against the door. Ethan jumped back, his breath catching in his throat. Another bang. Lena raised her gun, backing toward the far wall. Then sudden silence. The air around them stilled. Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. Lena's eyes widened. "Don't." But Ethan yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No sign of the Hollow Man, no sound, no movement, just the same dim, flickering light and the unsettling stillness that made Ethan's stomach twist. Lena exhaled shakily. "We need to get to the records room." Ethan nodded, stepping carefully into the corridor. "If this place even has one anymore." Lena gave him a grim look. "It does, but the real question is whether it'll let us find it." They moved carefully, the air in the asylum pressing against them like a living thing. The walls still seemed wrong, subtly shifting in ways that made Ethan's head ache. Then, as they turned another corner, something changed. The dust was gone. The broken furniture? Gone. Instead, the walls were clean, the floors polished, and the overhead lights were no longer flickering. It looked new. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Lena." A distant scream cut through the air. Not human. Something distorted, stretched, hollow. Then, suddenly, voices. Ethan turned. The hallway was no longer empty. There were people, doctors in white coats, nurses pushing carts, patients in hospital gowns walking down the corridor, their faces hazy, unfocused. Ethan's breath hitched. This isn't real. Lena grabbed his wrist. "Don't talk to them." Ethan turned back. The hallway stretched endlessly now, filled with movement, with echoes of the past. And then, someone stepped forward. A man in a doctor's coat. He looked directly at Ethan and spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Lena grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him backward. The moment she did, the lights flickered, and everything was gone. The dust returned. The hallway collapsed back into ruin, and the figures vanished. Ethan stumbled, breathing hard. His vision swam, his head pounding. Lena's voice was sharp. "We have to go." Ethan steadied himself. "What the hell was that?" Lena didn't answer. She was already moving. Ethan followed her, his skin crawling. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't just a hallucination. It was the asylum, and it was showing them something. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hall. It was marked Records Room. Lena hesitated. "Whatever's in here, it's been hidden for a reason." Ethan swallowed and nodded. Then he grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room wasn't empty. Someone was already there. Sitting at the desk in the dim light of a flickering lamp was a man in a disheveled white coat. His head hung low, his fingers twitching slightly over a stack of old files. Then slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes shallow, sunken, too dark. And then he smiled. "Dr. Victor Langley," Lena whispered. "The disgraced psychiatrist. The man who had started all of this. The man who had been missing for decades. Yet somehow he was still here, and he was waiting for them." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Dr. Victor Langley sat slumped at the desk, his pale, wrinkled fingers twitching over a stack of old files. His white coat, once pristine, was now yellowed and frayed, his collar hanging loose around his gaunt neck. He was supposed to be dead, yet here he was. Lena's grip tightened around her gun, her body tense. This isn't possible. Ethan took a slow step forward. Dr. Langley? The old man lifted his head. His eyes were wrong. The sockets were sunken, filled with something too dark, too deep. It was as if there was no end to them, just a void swallowing everything that had ever been human inside him. And then he smiled. "Welcome home," Langley whispered. The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Lena raised her gun. "You're not real." Langley's head tilted slowly, like a puppet on loose strings. "Aren't I?" Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. The room felt smaller, the shadows thicker. It was as if the asylum itself was breathing, shifting around them. Langley's smile widened. "I told you," he whispered. "Once you see him, you belong to him." Ethan felt a sharp sting behind his eyes, a pressure building inside his skull, a memory that wasn't his. The asylum, the experiments. Langley had tried to erase Feartoe, push the boundaries of the human mind beyond terror itself. But instead, he had let something in. Lena suddenly fired. 3 shots. The bullets hit Langley's chest. Nothing happened. No blood, no reaction. He simply blinked, as if mildly surprised. Then, slowly, he stood up. The lights flickered violently. The room around them melted away. Ethan blinked, and suddenly they were somewhere else. A long hallway, white walls, endless. Dozens of doors lined both sides, all open. From inside each one, whispers echoed. Soft, sinister. Lena grabbed his arm. "Ethan, we're not in the asylum anymore." Ethan turned, his breath catching. Langley was gone. Instead, at the end of the hallway, something waited. Tall, faceless. The Hollow Man. Lena's breathing turned ragged. "Don't look at him." Ethan tried to move, but his legs felt heavy. The air was thick, as if something unseen was pressing down on him, rooting him in place. The Hollow Man stood motionless, but Ethan could feel him watching. Then, it moved. Not walking, not stepping, just closer. An instant ago, it had been at the end of the hallway. Now, it was only 10 feet away. The whispers grew louder. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Why is it doing this?" Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "Because it doesn't want us to leave." Ethan forced himself to look away. He grabbed Lena's wrist. "There has to be a way out." The walls trembled. The hallway warped. Doors slammed shut, one by one, until there was only one door left. Ethan didn't think. He just ran. Lena was right behind him, her gun still clenched in her hand. The air around them hummed, the whispers turning into something low and guttural. The Hollow Man was right behind them. Ethan slammed through the door. Darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Just black, endless. Then, a voice. "You can't leave." Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was outside. The cold air hit him like a punch to the lungs. He gasped, staggering forward. The asylum gate stood before him, rusted and open. Behind him, nothing. The building was gone. Lena stumbled forward, dropping to her knees, her breathing uneven. Her hands trembled, gripping the dirt beneath her. Ethan turned to her. He swallowed. "We got out." Lena didn't respond immediately. She was staring at her own hands as if making sure she still existed. Finally, she whispered, "No one ever gets out." Ethan turned back toward the empty space where Ravenwood had stood. A week ago, there had been a building there. Now there was nothing but an overgrown field. It had erased itself, just like the people before them. Ethan's mind reeled. They had barely survived. Barely. And yet, the weight in his chest told him that something was still wrong. Something wasn't over. Lena slowly stood. "We can't stay in Blackwood." Ethan nodded. "Let's go." They climbed into the car, neither of them speaking as Ethan pulled onto the highway. The town faded into the rearview mirror, disappearing into the mist. After a few miles, Ethan finally broke the silence. "You think it's really gone?" Lena didn't answer right away. Then softly she said, "I don't think it was ever really here." Ethan's hands tightened around the wheel. Blackwood had been a trap. The asylum had been its bait. And the Hollow Man? The Hollow Man was still out there, waiting for the next person curious enough to look for him, waiting to whisper those same words, "Come home." I booked the Airbnb on a whim. Work had been suffocating, my phone never stopped buzzing, and I couldn't remember the last time I had an actual conversation that wasn't work-related. I needed space, just a few days away from my apartment, away from deadlines, away from people in general. The listing was exactly what I was looking for: a secluded guest house on the edge of a small town, tucked between a row of evergreens, promising peace, privacy, and the perfect weekend getaway. The photos showed a cozy one-bedroom cabin, all modern furnishings and soft, warm lighting. It looked clean, well-kept, and most importantly, had a perfect 5-star rating. The host, Daniel, had over 100 positive reviews. Guests described him as friendly but hands-off, the type who gave you your space but was always available if you needed anything. It sounded ideal. I booked it for 3 nights. I should have done more research. I arrived just after sunset on Friday. The drive had been longer than expected, winding roads through patches of dense forest. The last 30 minutes completely dark aside from my headlights cutting through the trees. The place was even more remote than I'd realized. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sky was deep indigo, the air cool against my skin. The house itself was exactly like the pictures: a sleek, modern guest house, tucked behind the main property. A row of porch lights cast a warm glow across the front steps, making the place look inviting. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, taking a deep breath of fresh, pine-scented air. For a moment I felt a sense of relief. No honking, no notifications, no city noise. Just quiet. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the front door, where a keypad lock blinked red. I checked my email for the entry code, typed it in, and heard the soft click of the deadbolt unlocking. Inside, the place was immaculate. The scent of clean linen and faint wood polish filled the air. The living room was small but thoughtfully decorated: a gray couch, a coffee table with a stack of books, a sleek flat screen mounted on the wall. The kitchenette had stainless steel appliances, spotless countertops, and a welcome note from Daniel sitting on the island. I picked up the card. "Welcome, make yourself at home. Let me know if you need anything." Simple, polite. No weird rules or excessive house instructions. I tossed my bag onto the couch and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first thing that felt off was the smoke detector. It was directly above the bidon of those sleek, modern units, flush with the ceiling. But there was a tiny black dot in the center of it, barely noticeable unless you were lying down and looking straight up. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for one thing. It was angled, not straight down like most detectors. It was tilted slightly downward toward the bed. I sat up slowly, my stomach tightening. It was probably nothing. Maybe it was just a design choice. Maybe I was overthinking it. Still, something gnawed at me. I stood on the bed, reaching up to inspect it. My fingers brushed over the small black dot. It wasn't smooth like the rest of the device. It felt like glass. A lens. My chest tightened. Number it couldn't be. I climbed down and grabbed my phone, quickly Googling how to tell if a smoke detector is a hidden camera. The results sent a sharp chill through me. Most modern hidden cameras use infrared sensors, meaning they'll reflect light in a certain way. If you shine a flashlight at them, the lens will often glow or bounce light back at you. My hands felt clammy as I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the black dot. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint glint. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the angle or the ceiling paint reflecting back at me. But something inside me wasn't convinced. I needed to be sure. I opened the camera on my phone and switched it to selfie mode. Then I held it up, angling it toward the smoke detector, looking at it through the screen. There it was, a tiny blinking red light. A camera. My stomach dropped. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't some internet rumor. This was real. I was being recorded. I dropped the phone onto the bed, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. How long had it been running? How many guests had stayed here without knowing? I felt exposed, violated. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, snapped a photo of the detector, and stormed out of the bedroom. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing: I was getting out of there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I tried to steady my breathing. The deadbolt clicked, and I yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch. The cool night air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. I turned to my car and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the driveway, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline of a tall man, half shrouded in darkness. I took a shaky step back. "Daniel?" My voice came out uneven, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned slow, deliberate, and walked into the trees. I stood there, my breath ragged, my body rigid with fear. I didn't wait. I bolted for the car, threw my bag into the passenger seat, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were trembling so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I sped out of that driveway so fast the tires kicked up gravel, my heart still hammering. I drove straight into town and parked outside a well-lit gas station. Only then did I realize I was still shaking. I reached for my phone, ready to call Airbnb support, ready to report what I had found. But when I opened the app, something made my stomach drop. The listing was gone, not just unavailable, completely erased. And Daniel? His account had been deleted. I had no idea who he really was, or where that footage had ended up. I sat in my car, parked outside a gas station, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers ached. The Airbnb listing was gone, vanished like it had never existed. And Daniel? Deleted. I stared at the screen, my breathing uneven. How? Just an hour ago, his account had over 100 glowing reviews. Now, it was as if he'd never been there at all. I forced myself to take a slow breath, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Airbnb removed the listing after multiple reports. Maybe Daniel shut it down himself, covering his tracks the moment he realized I'd figured it out. Either way, I had no way to contact him. But I wasn't letting this go. I opened the Airbnb app's customer support chat and started typing. I just stated a listing that had hidden cameras. The host's account is gone, but I need to report this. I sent the message and waited, my leg bouncing with anxious energy. The gas station parking lot was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow on my windshield. A response popped up almost immediately. "Hello, thank you for reaching out. Can you provide the listing address and any photos or videos you took?" I quickly typed out the address and attached the picture of the smoke detector camera. Another message came. "We take privacy violations very seriously. Our trust and safety team will investigate immediately. Did you notice any other concerning details about the property or host?" I hesitated, then typed, "I saw someone outside right before I left. I think it was the host." The reply was slower this time. "Were you harmed or threatened in any way?" I exhaled, rubbing my temple. Number, not physically, but something wasn't right. I typed, "No, but it felt like he was watching me." There was another pause, then, "We strongly recommend filing a police report in your local jurisdiction." Please let us know if you need further assistance. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was all they could do. Airbnb wouldn't hunt this guy down, they'd just remove him from their platform and move on. I needed to take this to the police. The station was about 10 minutes away, a squat brick building that looked more like an office than a law enforcement facility. I parked, gripping the wheel tightly for a moment before stepping out. Inside, the air was cool, sterile. A tired-looking officer sat behind a thick glass window. I cleared my throat. "Hi, I need to report something." The officer glanced up. "What's the issue?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling stupid. What was I even going to say? I found a camera in my Airbnb, then my host disappeared. It sounded crazy, but I couldn't just let it go. I took a breath. I stayed at an Airbnb tonight. I found a hidden camera in the bedroom. I left immediately, but when I tried to report it, the host's account had been deleted. The listing was erased too. I don't know who he really is, and I'm worried about where the footage might end up. The officer's expression shifted. He sat up straighter. "A hidden camera?" I nodded quickly. "In the smoke detector facing the bed." He grabbed a notepad. "Did you take photos?" I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the picture and showing him. His eyes narrowed. "That's not good." I felt a surge of relief. At least he was taking it seriously. "Did you find any others?" he asked. I hesitated. I didn't get the chance to check everywhere. Once I found that one, I panicked and left. The officer nodded, scribbling something down. "You said the listing disappeared?" "Yeah. When I went back to check, it was completely gone. Same with the host's profile." The officer's brow furrowed. He tapped his pen against the desk, thinking. "Do you remember the address?" I nodded, quickly reciting it. He turned to his computer, typing. The glow from the monitor reflected off his glasses as he scanned the screen. Then his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly, his eyes flicking back and forth as he read something. My stomach clenched. "What?" He glanced at me. "How long ago did you book this place?" "A week ago. Why?" Another pause. Then he exhaled, sitting back in his chair. "That house doesn't belong to anyone named Daniel." A cold wave of unease crawled up my spine. "What do you mean?" He turned the monitor slightly, showing me the screen. The property was listed under a completely different name. Not Daniel. Someone else. Someone who hadn't owned it for over a year. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. "Then who the hell did I just rent it from?" The officer leaned forward. "That's what we need to find out." The next few hours were a blur of questions, reports, and waiting. Another officer took me to a small interview room, where I went through everything: how I booked the listing, what I found, the man I saw outside. Then they asked a question I hadn't considered. "Did you leave anything behind?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, a few things. In my rush to get out, I hadn't even thought about it. My toiletries, a charger, some clothes in the bathroom." The officer's expression darkened. "We need to send someone to check the house." A pit of dread formed in my stomach. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the station lobby when an officer walked in, a serious expression on his face. "We checked the house," he said. I sat up. "And?" He hesitated, then said something that made my entire body go cold. "It was empty." I blinked. "What?" "No furniture, no bedding, no dishes, just empty." My mouth went dry. That wasn't possible. I had slept there. I had walked through the kitchen, touched the couch, unpacked my bag. And now? Nothing. Like I had imagined the whole thing. The officer crossed his arms. Either this guy cleared out in a matter of hours, or he never lived there at all. A sinking realization hit me. It was staged. The officer nodded grimly. "That's what we think." I felt sick. I had stayed in a fake house, rented from a fake person, and the entire time I had been watched. My voice came out weak. "Did you find any cameras?" The officer sighed. "We found mounts for them, but they were all gone." Every trace of surveillance, every hidden device wiped clean. Whatever footage had been taken of me was already out there. I had no idea where, or who was watching. I sat in the police station, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my mind spinning. The house was empty, stripped bare, like it had never been furnished in the first place, like I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I had slept in that bed, touched those countertops, stood under that hidden camera, and felt my stomach turn when I realized what it was. And now it was all gone. The officer in front of me, a man in his late 40s with a weary expression, folded his hands on the desk. "I need you to be honest with me." I met his gaze, my pulse still hammering. "I am." He nodded slightly. "Tell me one more time, step by step." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, and went through it all again. The listing, the perfect reviews, the house that looked just like the photos, how I'd settled in, unpacked, and gone to bed thinking I was completely alone. Then the smoke detector, the black dot that wasn't supposed to be there, the reflection in my camera that gave it away, how I'd fled only to see him, the man standing at the edge of the driveway watching me. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "We're going to run a search on Daniel." I frowned. His account was deleted. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. "That doesn't mean he's gone." His partner, a younger officer with sharp eyes, spoke for the first time. "Airbnb hosts need verified identities to list properties. Even if he deleted his account, we might be able to trace it." A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. But then, the older officer's voice dropped slightly. "You said the house belonged to someone else, that the actual owner hadn't lived there in over a year." I nodded. He exchanged a look with his partner. Then he reached for a manila folder on the desk and slid it toward me. "We pulled the records. That house has been vacant for a while. No official tenants. No one named Daniel ever owned it." I stared at the folder, my throat tightening. "So, what does that mean?" The officer's voice was flat. "It means someone broke in, set up fake furniture, and ran an illegal Airbnb scam out of a house they didn't own." The words hit me like a punch. I shook my head. It looked real. It felt lived in. The younger officer leaned forward. "That's the point. Staging a property isn't hard if you know what you're doing. Cheap rental furniture, a few decorations. It doesn't take much to make a place look legitimate." I felt sick. I had stayed in a house that didn't belong to anyone. I had booked a room in a place that was never supposed to be rented. The officer continued. "We checked the walls, floors, outlets. There were mounts for at least 4 hidden cameras. 2 in the bedroom, 1 in the bathroom vent, 1 in the living room. But they were all removed before we got there." My stomach churned. I already knew what he was going to say next. "That footage is out there somewhere." I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were white. "Can you track him down?" The younger officer ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "We're trying. If he used a stolen identity, it'll be harder. But if we find anything, we'll let you know." It didn't feel like enough. It wasn't enough. But what else could I do? For the next few days, I barely slept. I kept my phone on me at all times, refreshing the Airbnb app, checking my email for any updates. Nothing. I searched online, hoping to find something about other guests who had stayed there. No one had reported it. No Reddit threads, no news articles, just silence. Then, on the 4th day, I got an email. "Airbnb support. Privacy violation case update." I opened it with shaking hands. The email was short, too short. They were conducting an internal investigation, but couldn't provide any details. They had removed the listing permanently. The host was banned from the platform. That was it. No legal action, no real consequences. I felt my stomach drop. He got away with it. A week later, I finally got a call from the police. It wasn't what I wanted to hear. They had nothing. The Airbnb account was linked to a fake identity, prepaid phone numbers, and an untraceable bank account. Whoever he was, he had planned this carefully. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trail. It was like he never existed. They promised to keep the case open, but I could hear it in their voices. This was over for them. Not for me. I tried to move on. I deleted the Airbnb app, blocked their emails. I stopped traveling altogether for a while. Even now, I triple-check every hotel room, every Airbnb my friends book. But the worst part, the part that still keeps me up at night, I never found out who he was, what he wanted, where he uploaded that footage, because someone, somewhere, has it. Maybe it's locked away on a hard drive. Maybe it's on the dark web, passed around by people I'll never meet. Maybe it's already been deleted. Or maybe, just maybe, it was never about the videos. Maybe he just wanted to watch me, in real time, and now that I left, maybe he's found someone else. I've always been fascinated by the internet, not just the surface web, the part everyone uses daily, but the deeper layers, the kind of places you don't just stumble across, the kind of places you have to look for. I grew up online, spending countless hours learning how things worked, coding, networking, even a little ethical hacking. I wasn't a professional by any means, but I knew my way around. I understood how to protect myself, how to stay anonymous. The internet was my playground, a vast, endless maze of information, and I prided myself on knowing how to navigate it. But the more time you spend on something, the more it loses its excitement. The regular web had become boring to me. Social media, streaming, forums, they all felt shallow. That's why I started exploring the dark web. Not because I had any real reason to, but because it was there. A hidden world beneath the surface, full of mystery and secrecy. At first it was nothing special, just black market sites, conspiracy forums, weird archives of books and documents that weren't supposed to exist. Most of it was exaggerated, clickbait for the paranoid, but every once in a while I'd find something truly disturbing, something that didn't feel like it was meant to be seen. And that's where this all started. It was around 2 a.m. when I came across a discussion thread that caught my attention. It had no title, just a string of random letters and numbers, and only a handful of replies. The first post was simple. If you know, you know. If you don't, leave. I had seen cryptic messages like this before. Usually they led to some nonsense, but I was bored and I had nothing better to do. I clicked. The page that loaded was strange. A black background with a single blinking cursor, like an old command prompt. No images, no links, just a text box. Enter your request. I hesitated. It looked like some kind of database, maybe an archive. I decided to test it. I typed, "Show me something interesting." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered and a file name appeared. "Watch me, MP4. A download prompt followed. I hesitated. I knew better than to open random files from the dark web, but my curiosity got the best of me. I ran a quick scan. No viruses detected. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The video was low quality, grainy, like it had been recorded on an old phone. It showed a dark room dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center of the frame was a wooden chair. Someone was sitting in it, their face covered by a white cloth sack, their hands tied behind their back. My stomach twisted. The camera was completely still, like it had been set up and left to record. No movement, no sound, just the eerie image of this bound figure sitting alone in the dark. I skipped forward, but nothing changed. No one entered the frame, no one spoke. Just silence. Then, near the end of the video, something happened. The bulb flickered more aggressively, casting sharp shadows across the room. The figure in the chair twitched slightly, just enough to let me know they were still alive. Then the screen glitched. For a single frame, something flashed across the screen. Something I barely caught before the video cut to black. I paused and went back frame by frame. When I found it, my breath caught in my throat. A face, pale, emotionless, standing right behind the chair. Someone had been there the whole time, watching. I closed the video and sat back in my chair, my skin crawling. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I had seen disturbing things before, but something about this felt different. Like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I closed the site and cleared my history, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a video, probably fake, some weird underground horror project. That's what I told myself. But as I sat there, staring at my screen, a notification popped up, a new message. No username, no subject, just a single sentence. Did you like what you saw? I felt my stomach drop. I didn't reply. I didn't even move. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. How had they messaged me? I had used a VPN, routed my connection through multiple servers. My setup was solid. There was no way someone could have traced me. Another message appeared. You shouldn't have watched that. I reached for my mouse, ready to shut everything down, but before I could, a final message popped up. And this time, it wasn't a question. It was my full name. And beneath it, my home address. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. No, this had to be some kind of trick, some scare tactic. Maybe the website logged IPs after all, and they were using it to mess with me. But then I saw the next line of text appear. Mom. Dad. Little sister. Her full name. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just my information, they knew my family. I shot up from my chair so fast it nearly tipped over. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned around, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow in my room. My blinds were shut, my door locked. But for the first time in my life, I felt completely exposed. I turned back to my computer and slammed the power button, killing the screen instantly. My reflection stared back at me from the black monitor, my own face pale, my eyes wide with panic. I needed to think. I needed to do something. I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera feed. Nothing. The street outside was empty, just the usual parked cars and dim streetlights. But that didn't mean I was safe. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The line rang twice before a dispatcher picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I took a breath, trying to steady my voice. I think someone's stalking me, online. They sent me my address, my family's names. I don't know how they got it. Are you home alone? Yes. Have you seen anyone outside your residence? I hesitated. No, but a notification sound went off. My phone screen lit up with a new message. Unknown number. Calling the cops won't help. My breath caught in my throat. Sir, the dispatcher asked, are you still there? I swallowed hard. Yeah, I just got another message. Do not respond, she said firmly. Stay on the line with me. I'm dispatching an officer to your location now. I wanted to believe that would help, but deep down I knew whoever this was had already gotten too close. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. I stood by the window, phone gripped in my sweaty palm, eyes locked on the street outside. Still nothing, no movement. Then, finally, blue and red lights. I let out a shaky breath as the patrol car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area before approaching my door. I opened it before they even knocked. You reported an online threat? One of them asked, his voice calm but serious. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. They knew everything about me, my address, my family, everything. The older officer, Ramirez, gestured to my desk. Can you show us the messages? I hesitated before powering my PC back on. My fingers felt stiff as I moved the mouse, navigating back to the chat. But when I opened the messages, they were gone. Every single one. The thread was empty, like it had never existed. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process it. They were here, I swear. Ramirez gave me a long, unreadable look before turning to his partner. The younger cop, Hendricks, crossed his arms. Are you sure this wasn't just some elaborate prank? Huh? A wave of frustration crashed over me. No! I didn't imagine it. They sent me my family's names. Ramirez sighed. Look, we're not saying you're making this up, but if there's no evidence... Another notification sounded. My phone. I nearly dropped it as I fumbled to unlock the screen. Another message from the unknown number. Unknown number. They won't believe you. I turned the screen toward the officers, my pulse hammering in my ears. Ramirez's face darkened. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, we have a confirmed cyber-stalking case. Requesting cyber crimes unit involvement. Hendricks glanced out the window, suddenly more alert. Did they say anything about coming here? About watching you? No, I admitted. Just that I shouldn't watch the video. Ramirez's head snapped toward me. What video? I hesitated. It was a file I downloaded from a dark website. He exhaled sharply. Christ, you have no idea who you pissed off, do you? The officers stayed with me for another hour, taking statements, checking my security setup, and advising me to stay offline for a while. They also recommended changing all my passwords and contacting my ISP for extra security measures. But none of it made me feel safer, because whoever they were still watching, and they had already proven they were always one step ahead. I didn't sleep that night, even after the cops left, even after I double-checked every lock in the house, even after I turned off my computer and put my phone on silent. I just sat there, wide awake, heart pounding. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every shadow in the corner of my room felt wrong. I tried to convince myself that the police were right, that maybe this was just some sick online prank, some hacker screwing with me for fun. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random. Someone had been waiting for me to find that video. The next morning, I called in sick to work. There was no way I was leaving the house, not until I figured out what was happening. I spent hours combing through my system, running every security check I knew, my VPN logs, my browser history, my firewall settings. Nothing was out of place. No backdoors, no spyware, no signs that anyone had broken into my network. But if that was true, then how did they find me? I was still staring at the screen when a new email came in. No subject, no sender. Just an attachment. Watch, me MP4. My stomach twisted. I didn't open it, not this time. Instead, I right-clicked and checked the file properties. The metadata showed that it had been created just 10 minutes ago. They were still watching me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police again. Then my screen went black. No warning, just gone. The hum of my PC cut off. The power in my entire room shut down. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The lamp on my nightstand was still on, the hallway light still glowing under the door. The house still had power. It was just my room. Then, from the darkness of my monitor, a notification sound. My phone screen lit up. A new message. Unknown number. No more computers, let's talk. I almost threw my phone across the room. Instead, I forced my shaking fingers to type out a reply. Who are you? What do you want? 3 dots appeared. They were typing. Then the response. Come outside. A sharp, ice-cold dread gripped my spine. I stood up, moving slowly toward the window. My hands felt numb as I pulled back the curtain just an inch. And I froze. A car sat parked across the street. Black, tinted windows. The kind you see in movies when people are being watched. I squinted, trying to make out if anyone was inside. Then, as if they knew I was looking, the headlights flashed. A small, quick burst of light. I stumbled back from the window, heart slamming against my ribs. My breathing was too fast, too shallow. I wasn't imagining this. This wasn't some digital prank. They were here, watching me, waiting. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't go outside. I just backed away from the window, forcing myself to think. The police were useless. Even if I called them again, by the time they showed up, the car would be gone. I had to do something else. I had to disappear. First, I shut off my phone, pulled out the SIM card, tossed it. Then, I grabbed my laptop and drove 3 towns over to a public library. Logged into a fresh account using a brand new VPN and sent an encrypted email to a hacker forum I knew. Need to scrub my entire digital footprint. Willing to pay. I attached a Bitcoin wallet with enough to make it worth someone's time. 5 minutes later, I got a reply. Done. Don't contact us again. Just like that, everything connected to my real identity was wiped. It wouldn't stop them from finding me physically, but at least online, I was gone. I ditched my car in a crowded parking lot and took a bus back home, making sure no one followed. Then, as soon as I got inside, I packed. Not just a bag, everything. Laptop, gone. Hard drives, burned. Credit cards, cut up. By nightfall, my entire life was packed into a single duffel bag. I took one last look around my apartment. The place I had spent years in. The place that was supposed to be safe. Then, without looking back, I walked out the door. I wasn't coming back. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was at least 4 hours away from home. I paid in cash at a cheap motel off the highway, kept my head down and barely slept. Every sound outside the thin motel walls sent a jolt of panic through me. I kept imagining someone forcing their way in, dragging me out into the dark. But nobody came. By morning, I had a plan. I wasn't just running, I was disappearing completely. I took out as much cash as I could from an ATM before canceling my bank accounts. I bought a prepaid phone with cash, using it only to call my family and tell them I was leaving for a while. I didn't say why, just that they shouldn't worry. I didn't want them caught up in this. For weeks, I moved from place to place, never staying in one town too long. I worked odd jobs under the table, paid everything in cash, avoided cameras when I could. I didn't use my real name. I didn't use the internet. Eventually, the paranoia dulled. The feeling of being watched started to fade. But I never let my guard down completely. Because the truth is, I still don't know who they were. A hacker group? A secret organization? Just some lunatics who stumbled across me at the wrong time? I'll probably never know. What I do know is this. The dark web isn't just some playground for scary stories. It's real. And if you go looking for something you shouldn't, sometimes it finds you first. I don't scare easily, never have. Growing up in a rough neighborhood and working in high-stress environments has made me thick-skinned and level-headed. I'm the kind of person who hears a strange noise at night and assumes it's the wind, or a raccoon, at worst. Monsters don't exist, and ghost stories are just that, stories. At least that's what I've always told myself. But I can't explain what happened to me that night. I had heard of skinwalkers before. The name alone is enough to send shivers down your spine. According to legend, they're shapeshifters, beings that can take on the form of animals or even humans. Some say they're witches cursed by dark rituals. Others say they're ancient spirits, feeding on fear. They mimic voices calling for help in tones that sound human but lack emotion, luring unsuspecting victims closer. I always brushed it off as folklore, just stories told to scare people from venturing too far into the wilderness. I never gave it much thought until I found myself in a situation that made me wonder if those stories were more than just tales. Life had been weighing on me. Work had become a relentless grind. Family tensions were at an all-time high, and even my friends seemed to drain me. I needed a break, somewhere to clear my head. That's how I found myself packing for a solo camping trip. No one to bother me, no deadlines, no expectations, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive to the campsite was long, winding through forested roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I decided on a secluded spot, miles away from any trailheads or public camping areas. I wanted solitude, and I got it. By the time I arrived at the trailhead and started hiking, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, the kind that bites just enough to remind you you're alive. As I made my way deeper into the woods, something caught my eye. A deer stood motionless a few yards off the trail, staring directly at me. Its body was perfectly still, too still, as though it were frozen in time. Its eyes were unnerving, not soft and curious like most deer, but sharp and focused. It felt like it was studying me. I kept walking, brushing it off as my imagination. But then there was another one. A second deer stood farther ahead, staring in the same unsettling way, and another. Each one seemed to appear out of nowhere, their heads turning slowly to watch me as I passed. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't move away either. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of trance, and for a moment I felt like I was too. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the spell broke. The deer shook their heads, snorted, and bounded off into the woods like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but unease crept in like a shadow I couldn't shake. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my gut. About halfway to my chosen campsite, I saw a man wandering through the trees. He was swaying slightly, his movements uneven, like he might be drunk. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his head was down, his face obscured. I thought about saying something, a quick, "Hey, you good?" But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and erratic, like he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. Or maybe it was the strange sensation that washed over me, a feeling like I shouldn't draw attention to myself. He didn't seem to notice me, and I passed him without incident. I told myself he was just a guy enjoying the woods in his own way. But deep down, I knew better. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had almost set. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and tried to relax. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But that stillness didn't bring peace. It felt oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. I was starting to feel a little better when I heard it. "Help! Help me!" It was a man's voice, distant but clear. The words carried through the trees, echoing faintly. At first, I thought someone might actually be in trouble. I stood, straining to listen. "Help me! Over here!" The voice came again, but this time, something about it felt wrong. The tone was too flat, too monotone, like someone mimicking a call for help rather than genuinely needing it. It lacked urgency. "Help me," the voice repeated, almost like a recording. The same inflection, the same rhythm, over and over. It was closer now, but I couldn't see anyone. My skin crawled. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but something in the back of my mind screamed, "Don't." I sat back down by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The voice kept calling, circling my campsite. It would fade into the distance, then grow louder again, moving in an erratic pattern. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. They had been waiting for me to make a move, and the sound I'd heard, the scraping, it wasn't a random animal, it was deliberate. Someone had been touching the fabric of my tent. Someone had been taunting me. I looked further into the valley, hoping for an explanation, but the tracks, those boots, had wandered off into the wilderness, leading further into the desolate land. There were no signs of any other campsites, no vehicles in sight, just an empty, barren landscape stretching out before me. Whoever had been there wasn't coming back, but I didn't stick around to see if they would. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I threw my things into my truck, locked the doors, and drove off without a second thought. I didn't even care about the rest of the day's drive. All I cared about was getting out of there. I didn't look back. To this day, I haven't been back to Rabbit Valley, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, every time I go camping, every time I set up a tent and sit beneath the stars, I can't shake that feeling. The feeling of someone watching, someone waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. And every time the wind picks up and I hear a scrape on the side of my tent, I remember those boot prints. I remember the circle they made around me. I remember the eerie silence of that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the valley. I don't know if they were real or if it was all in my head. But I do know this. I'll never forget the sound of someone scraping their fingers across the side of my tent.